Today, I want to show you how I made this Ahsoka Tano headpiece. As you can see, this is just the interior. I will be making a part 2 on how I finish this, so make sure you're subscribed so that you can see that video. But today I just want to focus on really the structural part of it, how I got it to be flexible, how I got it to fit my head, and also how I got the contouring. Those were 3 things that I noticed in other people's headpieces that weren't quite what I would want it to be for my own headpiece. So those were the parts that I really focused on, and I got it to a point where I'm really happy with it. By no means is it perfect. There are definitely a lot of flaws in this, but I do just want to show you how I got it to look like this. Before I get started into the tutorial, I do want to note 2 things. Firstly, I have a list of supplies that I've gotten for this down below. And if you want to see a list of supplies that I've gotten for the entire cosplay, make sure you go and check out my previous video, which I will also link down below so you can check that out after you watch this one. But real quick, I also wanted to tell you how I started this journey of making the Ahsoka Tano cosplay, because a few months ago, I had not planned on making this cosplay. In fact, I hadn't really planned on making any cosplays at all. I had gotten into making some videos, trying to figure out character makeup, trying to figure out character styling. It's just something that's very interesting to me. And a few weeks ago, I thought I would try out Ahsoka. I was gonna do sort of a human version of her. I already had a white wig that I could use for her, and I was going to create a headpiece that would just kind of sit on my head like a headband or a hat. But what happened was I did not plan very well. I made the headpiece with aluminum foil as the base and paper clay as the top. If you've ever worked with paper clay before, you know that's not a good idea because it's not flexible, it cracks easily, it's very fragile, and it's really heavy as well. So it does not work as a headpiece. I have seen people use paper clay in headpieces before, and I'm sure that they probably know how to use it much better than I do. But as for me, it is not my preferred medium. After that failure, I was kind of thinking that it wasn't a complete, waste of materials, because I could probably use it as a stand for something. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. So what you'll see at the beginning of this tutorial is the original headpiece that I made being used as a stand for my pattern.
Alright, so in the clip that you just watched, as I was editing, I realized that I never actually got to the point. This is just typical of me because my brain is so annoying and it doesn't remember what I'm talking about half the time. Anyway, the point is that because the simple and easy headpiece did not actually turn out to be that simple and easy, I decided I might as well go ahead and make the legit headpiece that I would want to make in the future anyway.
Alright, so the very first thing that I did was I took a piece of paper I got from an Amazon package and covered it in painter's tape. You can also use masking tape, and if you don't have paper from a package like I have, you can always take a paper grocery bag and just cut it out so it lays flat. Basically, what you want to do is create for yourself a material that is flexible, but also able to be put into a sort of stiffened 3-dimensional shape without falling over. Now, when I was making my pattern, I actually ended up using my failed headpiece quite a bit to help me with the height and width measurements, because I had already figured that out beforehand. So I want to help you to figure out what dimensions for your headpiece will work the best with your own head dimensions. First, you're going to need to find a reference photo online. Whether you're doing Ahsoka or another character, go ahead and find a picture where they are front facing. Then you're going to want to print out that photo and grab a pen or marker, and we're going to figure out the dimensions of the character's face. Depending on your preference, you can either just eyeball the dimensions or actually use a ruler to figure it out. But the first dimension that I found was the height of the face. So measure from the chin of the character to the forehead where the headpiece is going to start. Then you're going to use your fingers or a ruler to take the measurement, shift it upward toward the top of the headpiece. For Ahsoka, it looks like her headpiece is about as tall as her actual face. So when I'm trying to figure out the height of my headpiece, I'm going to measure from my chin to my forehead, wherever I want the headpiece to start. And I'm going to take that measurement to use for figuring out how high I need my own headpiece to be. This measurement will be different depending on what character you're doing or what age of Ahsoka you're cosplaying, so just make sure that you use this method to figure out what proportions are going to look correct on your own head. Next, we're going to measure the width of Ahsoka's head tails. You're going to make that measurement just like you did with the height, and then we're going to shift it over to the face again. And here you can see that the width of her head tail is about from her ear to the other side of her nose. So when you're trying to figure out how wide that your tail should be, measure a straight line from about where your ear is or the side of your face is to the opposite side of your nose. Another measurement you're going to want to take is the length of the head tails. You can do this with a ruler or a measuring tape, but if you don't have either of those, take a piece of string or shoelace and use that to help you make your measurement. Once I had cut my pattern out, I roughly put it into a 3-dimensional shape, pinning it onto my mannequin head. At this point, you might have some pieces that are too big, some pieces that are too small. If they're too small, just add more tape, and if they're too big, well, you just cut it off. You may notice that I have a lot of markings on my patterns. I tried the pattern on my actual head so that I could see if the proportions looked correct, and if they didn't, I would mark it. If the tails looked like they were curving in or outward too much, I would put downward arrows to signal to myself after I took it off what direction I actually needed to make the pattern. And for the back, all you really need to do is figure out what length and width and shape that you want the back to be, then you're all good to go. This is the completed pattern with the tails taken off of it. My plan was to create the main structure, the main helmet, out of cushion, and then to add the tails on later. After I was completely done making changes to my pattern, I cut it directly in half. And then I cut out the separate triangular pieces, making sure to mark which ones went to the right side of my face, which ones went to the left, which ones were in the front, and which were in the back. That is extremely important so that you don't lose any pieces or use the wrong piece in the wrong spot. And initially I took off about 1/3 of the back piece because I thought I was going to structure it one way. I ended up doing something different with it, so just ignore that for now. Ultimately, I taped the two pieces back together, so yeah. The upholstery cushion or foam that I used was 1 inch thick and 22 by 22 inches wide. But the particular package that I got had 2 cushions in it, which was really good because I ended up using about 1.5 of these. Using my patterns, I laid them on top of the cushion and then traced around them with a Sharpie marker. Also, before cutting it out, I made sure to mark my foam pieces the exact same way I marked the pattern pieces. That way I wouldn't lose any of the pieces and put them in the wrong spot. Once I had all of the foam cut out, I then started to pin it to my mannequin head. After you cut it out, you're going to have flat edges like this. And when you try to put those pieces together in a 3-dimensional shape, you're going to get this. You're going to get a huge crack in between. And of course, if you sew them together, it might sort of close together correctly if you get it tight enough, but that also leaves a lot of room for bumps to happen and weird shapes that are not gonna look very good. So the way that I dealt with that issue was I just cut away sort of diagonals at certain corners so that when you try to put the pieces together, it creates an angle. So as you maneuver each of the cushion pieces and you try to get the general shape of the headpiece together, take your scissors and you just take little bits away at a time so that you can get the pieces to fit together properly like this. Just be careful that you're not taking too much away, because the thinner that this gets, the more likely it's going to tear. So I trimmed the foam on both sides and then pinned it to my mannequin head, as I said. But while I was doing this, I noticed that the horns weren't exactly as tall as I would have liked them to be. So all I did was I took some of my 1-inch foam, I cut it in half, and then I wrapped it around the horns until it basically looked sort of like the shape that I wanted. But in just a moment, you'll see that it got a little bit lumpy. I did a lot of trimming and pinning. I also added a few more pieces on top and on the front because I was starting to understand that the foam wasn't contouring as sharply as I wanted. And adding more foam, while it did give me more of the shape that I wanted, it also looked pretty lumpy, and covering it with fabric was not going to help that. So I had to think quick and come up with a solution. So my solution was to make an EVA foam cap that would basically just rest on top of what I had just created. I just took some printer paper and a Sharpie and did the same thing I did for the original pattern by tracing out the general length, shapes, etc. that I wanted for my EVA foam. Again, all of the supplies I am using in this video are listed down below in the description, but this was a 4mm foam, and it was super easy to cut with just normal office scissors if you don't have something fancy to cut foam out with. But yeah, after that, all I did was pin it straight onto the cushion headpiece that I had just made, and it looked pretty good. I glued the EVA foam together with barge cement. I also bought this DAP quick seal that you honestly don't need to use on this piece because it's going to be covered up anyway, but I just wanted to show it real quick just in case you want to ever make a headpiece that doesn't have fabric wrapped over it. You can use this DAP quick seal to fill in any cracks or holes in between the foam. And I didn't do the best job of this because I am a beginner, but I used my sister's Dremel just to smooth out all of the edges and to try to get the front and the back in particular to be sort of tapered off so that it wouldn't become something that was sticking out, poking out underneath my fabric. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the helmet part. Now on to the tails. I used poly pellet stuffing beads, fiberfill from Polyfill, and also some white spandex. I bought 3 yards of this, but honestly that was way too much. I probably could have gotten away with 1.5 to 2 yards. So you'll see here that I am pinning some foam pieces to the headpiece that I just made. And the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted the top of my tails to have some kind of structure to them so that it wasn't just all stuffing. At this point, all you need to know is that I cut the foam pieces at diagonals just like I did for the rest of the headpiece. And then I stitched them together down the center because I had a piece that was the front and the back. Yeah, so I'll get to that in just a minute. I used my pattern pieces for the tails and just placed them over 2 layers of the fabric. Now you can mark your pattern onto the fabric by using chalk or perhaps some kind of fabric pen. I personally just use pins to roughly outline my pattern, and I know this is kind of dangerous because your pattern can just slip off and you could cut the wrong shape, but for me it worked fine. So as long as you're careful, this can also work. So instead of stitching these pieces together by hand, I actually took them to the sewing machine, making sure not to close up the top because you do need those to be open to stuff them and to turn them inside out. Having said that, it's perfectly okay to hand stitch them. I just recommend that whether you sew them by hand or by machine, that you double stitch them at least. What I mean by this is just go over your stitches 2 or 3 times after the initial stitch because the seams can easily tear apart, especially with this fabric being so stretchy. A couple times when I've tried my piece on, I pulled on the tails just a little bit too much and tore the seams, so I had to go back in by hand and stitch them again. So now going back to the upholstery cushion you saw me cutting, I used that as sort of a seam hider. So what I did was I took the cushion and I wrapped the fabric around it so that you didn't actually see the edges of the fabric anywhere. With the cushions inside of the basically tail sock that I've created, I filled the tips of the tails with polyfill stuffing pellets, which helped give them a little bit of weight, and that's what's gonna give you swing. But because they are a little bit weighty and they're also a little bit bumpy on the outside when covered with fabric, you're gonna want to stuff the rest of it with just your regular like pillow stuffing. This is what they look like pinned to the head. I just hand sewed them on. So for the back piece, I did almost exactly the same thing. I used my pattern to cut out my fabric. I made sure I had a front and a back piece. And then I went ahead and sewed it together on the sewing machine. But when I tried to stuff it like I did the side pieces, it did not look right. It was just so lumpy. And if you look in reference photos, then the back tail on Ahsoka is a lot smoother and also has sort of a ridge right down the center. So what I did was I took my pattern, and remember how I cut about a third of the top off? I used the bottom part to cut out some foam in the same shape that I cut out the fabric. Then I just stuffed it down to the very bottom of my fabric pillow, and then I only stuffed the back part, the part that's going to be facing your neck and back, so that nobody can see the lumps. It's not overly lumpy, but the lumpiness that is there is going to be facing toward you, not toward everybody else. And this actually looked really good. So then I just took the tail, I put it on the back of the head, and I sewed it on exactly the same way that I did the other two pieces. The only difference is I did not use a piece of cushion right at the top. So this is what the piece looks like with all of the tails attached. And there were still a few things that needed to be tweaked before actually putting fabric over top. Firstly, I was noticing when trying the piece on that there were gaps right around my face, and I didn't like that because it was showing my hair and my ears, and that wasn't good. So I noticed that when I pinched the back of the headpiece, it would alleviate that problem. So originally I had planned to try to make sort of a DIY adjustable elastic strap. I ended up just using plain elastic with no doodads attached to it. But yeah, I just sewed it onto the back by hand, and that was that. Oh, one other thing, before attaching the elastic, I wanted to make sure that every place that had exposed cushion was covered by fabric. So I went ahead and covered the back with fabric. Fabric sewed to fabric is much stronger than fabric sewn on to cushion. And so I just wanted to have that foundation to sew into something that actually had some kind of grip. One other issue I wanted to solve before adding the fabric on top was to really sew down the corners of the EVA foam to the rest of the headpiece, because it was sort of popping up, and I was afraid that once I had covered it in the fabric that it was just gonna poke up and look funny. So I went ahead and just stitched a few stitches into each of the corners that were sticking out. Finally, getting to wrapping the fabric. So because the tails already were covered in fabric, I didn't want to go ahead and cover the entire thing up just in case it got really wrinkly. But what I did want to do was cover up the EVA foam, the remaining cushion. So I went ahead and I took the fabric and just draped it over the top, pinning it and stretching it so that it was taut and so that there were very few wrinkles. Once I had the fabric pinned and fitted to the top of the head, I trimmed off what I didn't need. And make sure that if you're doing this, you leave extra fabric, because you can always fold the fabric under and pin it and see how much you need. But once you cut that off, you can't add more fabric on. Remember to pin it inside out if you're gonna do machine work. Even if you're gonna stitch it by hand, it makes it easier to actually sew. And then once you turn it inside out again, you'll be able to hide all of your seams. And of course, when you're finished sewing on the machine or by hand and you fit it over the top, you will have to secure the sides. And I just hand stitched it on. And one other thing that I don't think I even showed was that I did put fabric on the inside of the headpiece before adding this final piece of fabric on top. So here's the final headpiece, and I'm really happy with how it turned out so far. The next thing I have to do is cover it in latex and acrylic, which I'm going to do a mix of. If you guys want to see that video, make sure that you subscribe so you can see it. So that's it for this Ahsoka Tano interior headpiece tutorial. If you want to check out the behind the scenes, then make sure that you check out my Instagram at Core Wonder. I will be giving you guys all sorts of insight into what I'm doing before my YouTube videos even come out. I will always put my stories that relate to my behind the scenes progress into highlights, so you can go check those out on my main page. But yeah, thank you guys. I'll see you guys next time.